Hey Swale, this is Dave Sheppy, and I'm going to present this narrated PowerPoint presentation on behalf of the Salthamach Integrity Analysis Project team. That includes myself, Catherine Sharman, Leonard Feldis, Gillian Spies, Carrie Ardell, Carrie Lynn Victor, Colin Green, Shanna Roberts, Tana Mussel, and Uwe Stromberg, with graphic recording included by Melissa Kenzerski. And this presentation is about the Salthamach integrity analysis, and it provides an introduction, objectives, and an outcome foundation out of work that's been ongoing throughout the course of our pilot collaborative stewardship forum between the Salthamach Stewardship Alliance and British Columbia. Now, this project arises from a backstory of research into what aspect of stewardship and what sort of research in the field of stewardship can be carried out in support of reconciliation. And this image that we're looking at, Decolonization and Capital Assets Framework, arises from an outcome of prior work in 2019 that included this STSA and focused on gaining input from leadership and knowledge holders as to how to approach collaborative stewardship and what's needed to include in that work incorporating Stalo perspectives to indigenize and decolonize this practice and this field of practices that have such tremendous value in an interconnected and sustainable, healthy ecosystem linked to a wide array of aspects of capital connections to institutions within our world around us. That's the backstory. Outcomes of the findings, really with regards to indigenizing and decolonizing and approaching collaborative stewardship, are fundamentally now embedded in all of the CSF project works that we're doing, beyond just this one, the STIA project itself, although the STIA, or Salthamach Integrity Analysis, itself occupies a central place in and amongst the 7 themes and 20 plus projects of our overall collaborative stewardship forum. It really is intended to create a foundational perspective and methodology incorporating Stalo Indigenous worldview and perspectives integrated into Western scientific practices, as we'll see, applied to a very fulsome perspective on land stewardship. And so we call this the Salthamach Integrity Analysis, and particularly a focus on the Jones Creek watershed as a pilot project. Salthamach is our world, or our land, in Halkomelem, and the integrity analysis itself is intended to develop a methodology for assessing the well-being of Salthamach in its various elements, and again, including Indigenous Stalo Coast Salish Huelmach worldview, including principles, theories, and practices. Again, these are informed by people including Stephen Point, Herb Joe, Dalton Silver, Sonny McKelsey, Gwen Point, and many of the old people, and many others living today who have contributed their understanding of how to approach taking care of what belongs to Stalo peoples and applying that to land management, land stewardship. We also embrace relevant Western scientific practices and bring them together with Indigenous worldview and practices. We take a holistic, interconnected, intergenerational, and cumulative approach to relationships that constitute Salthamach, and again, based in this case on a watershed-based scope, again, drawing from work by Ken Lertzman and others who have focused on the watershed as a unit of study and an ecosystem based unit for this type of work and applying it here. And we come up with a 5-step process of integrity analysis that are laid out in the image on this page. Step 1 being defining resources, or otherwise we're including the term skakamis rather than resources, skakamis as gifts of the creator. Okay, what's recognized out there within this system? And we work in Letsamot as a principle of collaboration, a collaborative process here, working together as one team and being of one mind in what we're doing, independent of, and no matter who you are, where you're coming from, we worked on this as a team under and within the concept of Letsamot. In this image is shown Saltmach and the lower Fraser River watershed and the home of Stalo peoples. And here you see the pilot area in that small image indicated as the watershed running northwards into the Fraser River, the Stalo, in the central Fraser Valley. To carry on with the steps, step 2 is to conduct an inventory. So what's actually there? What information do we have? Building on the definition of Skachamis and what we recognize as elements of the watershed, then we go in inventory. At that point, and at this point of our work, it's necessary to establish a foundation for understanding Skachamis and the construct of the watershed as a natural living being. And the image we're looking at here comes from what Mark Point brought to us as the hierarchy of man, where humans were placed here last in the process of the world being created by Chichel Siam, the creator. And the humans being placed here last were also the weakest of all things. And so this image shows the Skachamis framework, an anatomy of a natural living being, aka a watershed. And it has 2 scales. From the center, what was established first, and which is least dependent on everything else being most dependent upon what's in the middle of this set of circular connections, is the sun. Beyond that, the order of creation and dependence, points of dependence by other realms, are the earth, the air, the water. Beyond that, the microbes, the soils, the insects, the fish, the flora, amphibians, the birds, the animals, and again, lastly, human beings, all on an array of increasing dependency from the sun to us humans. And across these array of inhabitants of Skachamis are a foundation of interdependency and interconnectedness. So no one thing is independent of the other. Everything is in fact dependent in some way on everything else, although some have a greater degree of dependency. And again, human beings placed here last as the weakest of all things are the most dependent in this system. This sets out a foundational basis for understanding and approaching the Saltmach integrity analysis. And it's different than a Western perspective and scientific paradigm. It's different than the paradigm that's carried with us today from the 16th century, stemming from the philosophy of Descartes and this Cartesian approach to understanding and exploring the world around us, where quite contrary and different to the image that we just saw is an us and them kind of relationship, not one of interconnectedness, but one of separation. And rather than the sun being at the center here, in fact, the center of this world is the human mind, which is held as distrusting all sensory input and information. It's based on a foundation of logic, needing to separate and isolate itself as a self from even its own body. It implies and works on a basis of total objectivity that is the only source of truth, and it's included and encapsulated in this statement, famous statement by Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." And it excludes and isolates the human mind from the human body, all or aspects of sensory input, from the sun and the universe and the systems of planets that were found by Kepler and Galileo to be actually different than had been previously thought where the Earth is not the center of the universe. And this created a human crisis, driving Descartes' 16th century philosophy. The environment itself is a term that implies disconnection as opposed to connection. The mind is distinct from the environment. It's different than the concept of a biosphere or an ecosphere. And it separates the mind, as in the us, from the them, which includes all other things, but not humans, even in that view. So an outcome of Descartes' 16th century thinking is that man is put at the center of all things. It is the priority, is above all things, perhaps only subject to God. And from a STIA perspective, then, we revert back to the model that was initially put forward. And in our work, we aim to inventory skachamis, the gifts of the Creator. And we as people, placed here last, are actually doing the work to understand our place in the world through these inventories that we currently have in progress, looking at water quality and air quality as two key and interconnected elements to the cycle of relationships. Plant inventories, LiDAR mapping, digital mapping inventories using contemporary technology to give us insights into the lay of the land. We're also looking at cultural heritage inventory work, and we're targeting work to be done in the realm of mycorrhizal connections between fungal root systems in the soil, mycelium fungi, and other types of fungi, but their connections and connecting tissues to tree roots and other plant roots to create this system of connectedness and interconnectedness and relational aspects of reciprocity that Suzanne Simard and others have called the wood wide web. We look at age class composition, salmon, wildlife, mountain goat, and do more high elevation historical air and water quality testing through glacial ice core testing. We bring this together, how and for what purpose? And for that purpose of working to develop a baseline information to look at the now of the world around us and to place that in the context of a STIA worldview, in particular, establishing a model using Tomyuk, the 7-generational outlook and term describing the relationships 7 generations past and to now and 7 generations future to now. And the now is the foundation of that inventory. What's out there today? And placing it in this Tomyuk model, where the Tomyuk model we're drawing here as representing the relationship between strands of time, DNA, the vibration of a heartbeat, the vibration of a drum beat, things that are foundational to our lives and represent generational connections, we put together like this. So we stand at the now middle point as the always middle point of the 7-generational outlook, with the principle of caring for our future generations, knowing the connectedness to our past generations, and that we today carry this connection and have an impact, not only today, but actually back in time, if you think about it that way, and also forward in time through the actions that we take and how we work with our land and our people in the realm of stewardship. So knowing what's out there now allows us to connect with this, the heartbeat of the living being, the natural living being that we're working with here, and to work through our system to then add more information on top of that inventory of today and all these aspects of Skokomis. We also need to understand how we got to this point in terms of the effective activities of land use, both past and present. So what's occurred to have affected what we are seeing out there today? We also want to know who's responsible for those activities. Whose laws? Which laws? And what foundations of governance? Looking at this in the long term for perhaps thousands of years of effective activities and the governance of those effective activities, coming to now through the contact period of what was prior an indigenous foundation solely to the relationship to the land, now coming into a position in a relationship that incorporates a colonial foundation of governance that's housed within British Columbia and also the federal government systems in relationship to First Nations in Stalo, who are still here today and continue to exist and assert and apply their governing systems now in relationship to those of the province and federal governments. All of this comes into play and is accounted for in Tamiuk. Our steps towards inventorying and understanding the effective activities and our governance inventories are in progress. We're looking at legislative inventories across provincial and federal systems as they are applied and effective within the Jones Creek watershed. We're looking at land status and interest analysis, provincial and federal as well. Who's out there on the land? Who are the agents of change or, through the various activities that link to land use? And who has access and actual interests and rights to any degree in the land, and how are they established, whether through a license, lease, or tenure, or through a system of names established through indigenous governing processes, or through family-based rights to access and use and take care of areas out there on the land. We address in this way governance through all of the systems that exist, and we address Stalo First Nations and tribal lands and areas of interest and activity as well through understanding that system of governance. And what we've targeted to be done is the extrapolation of past activities from current Skokomis inventories, and also look to develop a better understanding of the indigenous laws of the land through Shwokweam and foundation of governance and law, which then leads to inform people's behavior on the land. Again, coming from the land itself in many cases, in the constitution of Stalo, laws and principles established through the transformative actions of Chachels that are set out in the period of the distant past, and the actions of the transformers accounting for Shwokweam. Shwali is a key term here and a key part of the system of interconnectedness that is effectively a shared spirit, a shared life force, and is bundled into everything that we're doing in the holistic, cumulative, collaborative, and intergenerational approach to the watershed stewardship action plan that ultimately, in this final step of our work, we're aiming to put together. So Tamiuk is a key principle linked to the natural living being, interconnectedness, shared spirit of Shwali, and putting that together into understanding how things are today, the integrity analysis part. And we've set up a method for doing this by looking at a basis of diagnosis, a basis of prognosis, leading to planning. And the key part is working with the watershed as a natural living being and treating that being in a manner that a doctor would treat a patient, in a sense, although that's the wrong analogy. This living being is by no means a patient of ours, but ultimately a living being we're dependent upon to be in good order to be healthy for our well-being and everything else's well-being. So treating it with that huge respect, it's a sacred being that we want to find out how they're doing. And this is a way to approach it. These are conceptual plans that we've formulated into something more specific through an assessment wheel as a basis for diagnosis. And at the center, reproducing the natural living being in its various elements. That includes us, again, humans as the last and to be established in the weakest of all things, back to the hierarchy of man, and establishing spheres around that core that represent elements, indicators of inquiry, could be one or many, as a subject area. Beyond that, agents of change, the effective agents as activities and causes of change through time. And then the scope of change. So you can see how we're putting together our plan. We start with this understanding of relations. We move to examine and understand the elements of the system, our inventories, our aspects of change, the scopes of change, so that for any particular thing, water, air, wildlife, plants, fungi, we can assess the well-being of that aspect of this natural living being through the implementation of this assessment wheel, which leads to a plan as the next steps. And we are taking this methodology that we've established as a foundation and looking to apply it and pilot it to within the context of a long-term 7-generational outlook. In fact, a 1,000-year view is needed to establish our goals here fully, and including the regeneration of old-growth cedar, which we know has been vastly diminished in the past 150, 200 years through logging practices that were applied in the region. We want to reestablish the well-being of this being, and we know that one area of impact is specific to the loss of old-growth cedar. And we intend on developing ongoing monitoring and assessment of keystone species, including salmon, as next steps, and looking at changes in governance relationships, which brings us to shared decision-making. Shared decision-making is what we get to at the end of the day, putting this all together and working together in a collaborative process to do something, to work towards deciding what to do and developing and implementing this plan. And what we've come up with is either what you might call a spectrum of shared decision-making processes or a ladder of shared decision-making processes that are set out here in a sequence of images founded on a model of relations that's been recently developed, which we call the 3-row model of relations. And it comes from a foundation in the Haudenosaunee 2-row wampum belt that sets out 2 rows, vertical rows here, in this case, one for the Crown and one for Indigenous people, each having and maintaining their own customs, laws, and beliefs unaffected by the other. These are areas of autonomous societal being, and in effect also an element of that autonomous decision-making. So the first image shows the key rows. The third row, again articulated in a bit more detail in figure 5.2, shows the interconnectedness. In addition to the 2-row model is this. The third row is added to make a space for connected relationships that maintain the autonomy and the separation of autonomy, but bring together the peoples into a third row. This is the new piece of the relationship that's effectively a row of shared decision-making. And that, in large part, is how we mediate the relationships between the two societies that are here, in effect. The Western Canadian society, the Indigenous peoples, occupying the same place now and having different views of the land and uses of the land, what's appropriate, how to proceed, what the foundations for thinking are. And the third row brings that together. And this collaborative stewardship forum work we're doing here and in their other areas of work are models for how to proceed in developing, occupying, and working together in that third row, much of which is founded in relations to land and stewardship. And in its fullest form to date, we've developed this image, which fleshes out elements of that third row and is a form of a ladder, moving from the top to the bottom. It could also be viewed as a spectrum. No matter which way you turn it, it still works. It's a ladder vertically, it's a spectrum either way, ranging from the base of the ladder as the status quo, looking at engagement, consultation, things like that as some form of connectedness around decision making. Through that ladder, through various aspects of collaborative stewardship, we occupy some in multiple parts of the ladder, through points, 4, 5, 6 perhaps, moving up and beyond to shared decision making that can be established through a relationship of laws and policies, the delegation of laws and so on, decision making under provincial systems or federal systems, all the way up to number 9, the top of the ladder as we understand it, is concurrent law, where each party has their own lawmaking powers that relate to one another in a system of concurrency. All of the third row is a matter of letsamot, working together. And what this shows is that there's multiple ways to approach shared decision making. It isn't just one thing. And this was developed through the South Timuc Integrity Analysis team as one of our significant outcomes. And again, based on a 3-row model and a design that comes from Chief Terry Horn, a well-known carver and chief of the Yaqaquiyos First Nation of the Chilkoyak tribe. So a Shwakwith design of interconnected triangles that are common to Stalo design elements, and that Chief Horn produced specifically to represent this model in a Stalo way. And that brings us to where we are, which is having established a foundation for our next phases of work. And wrapping this up now gives us a basis to develop plans for where we go from here to continue building and aim to pilot the work we've established, and that's coming up in the near future, to be continued. On behalf of the South Timuc Integrity Analysis team, Lahai.